I'm a former British diplomat. I resigned from the Foreign Office over the Iraq War. And since then, I set up an NGO dealing with political causes for democratic countries and movements around the world. But since then, I've also had a journey where I've ended up as a believer in anarchism, which is a rather strange thing for somebody who comes from my background, which is very much government, top-down authority, neoliberalism, to believe basically the opposite of that. There is a contradiction in my current work. I started an independent diplomat before I came to embrace these principles, and now independent diplomat is much more than me. It's 25 people who have a say in the future of independent diplomat, most of whom would not regard themselves as anarchists. So I have to be respectful of their views. Equally, we deal with the world as we find it. The organisation was set up to get the voices of those excluded into diplomatic process, and I define diplomatic process as a governmental process. The way I answer those contradictions is by saying that in every case, whether my work as an anarchist or my work with independent diplomat, what we're trying to do is have people who are most affected be part of the decision-making about their issue. And I think that is a consistency that is legitimate. And we only help democratic governments, we only help democratic movements. That's not always a cut and dry decision to make, but we do make it very carefully. We have a very, very thorough process to assess what we call our clients. And if one of the countries we're helping starts to oppress its own people or abuse democracy, as has happened in a couple of cases, we stop helping them. With Independent Diplomat, we work and have worked for 7 years with the Marshall Islands, which is a low-lying Pacific island archipelago, which is already suffering very severe effects of rising sea levels and climate change, the double whammy of frequent droughts, desalination of their water supplies, and more and more frequent flooding. The President's garden is getting frequently flooded. There's a real prospect that if this continues on current trends, their country will disappear and they'll be made climate refugees. So it's an existential issue of primary importance for them. And we have long had a discussion with them about what is the most effective policy means to address it. For the President and her government, the President's an enormously impressive woman, it's the number one priority. And so they think about this very hard, whether in transforming their own economy or what to do internationally about it. And they believe, with reservations, that the international UN process to get climate agreement amongst the 193 member states of the UN is a necessary step. They certainly don't regard it as sufficient, but they think it's a necessary step to start creating a framework, particularly an investment framework where companies begin to realise that legislation will be aligned around these international commitments to reduce carbon. I know that all sounds a bit yada-yah, and it's certainly not enough. I don't think they would accept, and certainly I don't accept it's enough. But they don't reject it in its entirety. I think climate change is an epic global crisis, and I think it could trigger radical political change because it is, in a sense, something that's happening outside the system. It's beyond the usual political discourse, and I think more and more people are understanding that it is a very, very serious and urgent crisis, and the actions of our current governments to address it are nothing like sufficient. So that arguably could trigger a radical change. On the other hand, the trouble with climate change as a problem is that it's the boiling lobster problem. You know, the lobster that's been boiled doesn't realise it's been boiled to death. The boiling frog, sorry, maybe. The lobster does realise, the frog might not, that it's just happening so gradually that it becomes kind of part of the new normal. People just kind of accept it, whereas if you don't have enough to eat, that is a very urgent problem that has to be addressed. And there's no question that where we have seen radical revolutions, including violent revolutions with millions of people on the street, there has been very urgent social conditions that have triggered that. People who are well fed tend not to demonstrate violently in a way that overthrows governments. That's just seems to be the case from history. I'm not saying that's always the case, but it seems to be largely the case. But I think a new generation of people, young people in particular, are growing up for whom it's very obvious that the current form of politics and economics is not working, and in fact is very dangerous and is contributing to the problem that we have. One of the troubling things about government is that the power of big business, the big business lobby, it isn't even a lobby in a sense. They're not having to come into government and bang on the door and deliver a set of talking points. It's just taken for granted that their views are as important as anything else. That in any policy decision, there's the government view, the politician's own view, there's the business view, and then kind of everybody else's. The press matters to politicians a lot, but that's the only way the popular will is important to them. And I observe that with governments of different iterations, Labour and the Conservatives. So it's kind of part of the weft and weave of government already. It's not even a lobby necessarily. I saw when I worked on Iraq that big oil companies would have access at a senior level to my government in a way that NGOs who were worried about the humanitarian consequences of sanctions, for instance, had no such access. They saw people like me, whereas the big oil companies saw my ministers to say, you know, we're worried about the fact that we're not getting contracts with the Iraqi government to exploit its vast oil resources. That was their big concern. So it's just an intrinsic part of the way government is, and governments justify it, politicians justify it, civil servants justify it to themselves that this is about Britain's economic interests. That they formulate the philosophical view of people in government is that Britain has interests. These are the interests of the British people, and its economic and commercial interests are articulated by big business, not by the workers, but by business, the heads of business, the heads of Shell, BP, who are of course not even British companies, but that's another matter. British Aerospace, a great example. British Aerospace had representatives in one of the embassies I worked in whose only job was to work alongside Ministry of Defence officials to sell arms to the country where their embassy was. You can see that business interests are to a considerable degree driving British policy in Yemen, which is a disgrace because Britain is basically turning a blind eye to gross Saudi war crimes, the blockade of humanitarian supplies to the Yemeni people, which is causing immense suffering, tens of thousands of deaths, etc., etc. And Britain is permitting this, along with the United States. One important reason it's permitting this is that Saudi Arabia is a huge customer for British Aerospace, the biggest customer I think they've ever had. The largest arms deal in history at the time was the arms deal between British Aerospace and Saudi Arabia. And indeed, diplomats in the Foreign Office would say that the British Embassy in Riyadh is essentially just an arm of British Aerospace, that they're basically just arms salesmen. That's what the embassy was for. Terrorism and that whole discourse of the war on terror has altered that. That's now another kind of strand of mutual dependence in the way that it's seen in governments, that the Saudis are helping us with counter-terrorism and sharing intelligence, even though the Saudi policy is at the heart of one of the reasons, not the only reason, that we have extremist terrorism. So, you know, that understanding is completely absent in government. So it's really important to understand the hand-in-glove nature of the corporate relationship with government. I think it's important to think about them as what they are, which is they are self-interested entities that are trying to maximise profit. They're not evil. The people who work in them are not evil. And I think that whole kind of demonisation is profoundly unhelpful. You have to understand why they do what they do. And they are trying to maximise profit in all circumstances. And if they don't do that, they will be taken over. So banks undertake ever more risky lending, because lending is how they make money. And if they don't undertake it, somebody else will, and somebody else will make the profit. And if that company's share price will go up, and it will take over the bank that hasn't taken the risks. So there's this inherent engine for ever riskier financial behaviour, for instance, but that is because banks are like what they're like. It's not because they're run by evil people. I'm not particularly fond of bankers myself, but nonetheless, we have to understand why they are like they are. And what that leads to, of course, is a different way of approaching them. And obviously the way to approach them is to replace them structurally. That the whole nature of the profit-seeking enterprise is part of the problem, that it is damaging us as a society, that it's not aligned with the collective human interest. In fact, it's a motor for things that ultimately harm us.